Hey, welcome to Just 15 Minutes. My name's David. Right, on this one, we're going to have a look at if we can get to a free cloud hosted VM to be used, and ideally to be used permanently. Um, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, that might be true, but let's give it a go. Okay, DigitalOcean. Okay, so this was one I kept forgetting about, and my good friend Tim, I think, uses this as well. But it's not free, although there are free options that you'll see in a second. But DigitalOcean have been around for quite some time, actually. And again, there's thousands of these out there, but these are just ones that I've either used or I've got some reasonably good advice about why they're good and stable, etc. But on the DigitalOcean side, you do have things called droplets, which are essentially highly efficient virtual machines. I couldn't say it better myself. So the idea is they're starting at $4 a month. So that's pretty good. Now, yeah, they're going to be a very low level, sorry, not low level, but low resource based VM. But again, it depends what you're trying to do. Um, you don't have to build, really complex systems to start with. You're probably starting with a POC, a proof of concept, or something like that. Interestingly, you can actually deploy Kubernetes for $12 a month, which is pretty interesting actually, but we're going to leave that alone. Kubernetes, if you don't know, is sort of a VM or container orchestration. Actually, more for containers, sorry, not necessarily VMs there. But we'll maybe cover a little bit about that later. Okay, but you can see down here we've got functions. So these are the serverless functions, a bit like Azure Functions or AWS Lambda. So these are where you don't have to write a whole application. You could just have a function, literally a piece of code that acts on either it's on a schedule or it's on a trigger, like somebody requests from an API endpoint. And they start at 0 a month. I mean, come on. But anyway, let's focus still on the VM. So if we look at the pricing of the droplet, so one droplet is essentially a mini VM. So yeah, so the $4 a month one is 512 meg of RAM, one virtual CPU. Okay, now you've got 10 gig of storage and 500 gig of transfer, which is pretty liberal, really. Okay, so you can see how much it costs per hour, but that is the monthly cost. So you'll pay no more than $4. That's pretty awesome, actually. Yet it's a 512 meg, but even the gig is only 6. Obviously, it goes up a little bit, but even though these aren't free, that is close to nearly free. Obviously, if you don't have $4, then it isn't free, is it? But anyway, that's a pretty useful one. And again, these are going to be Linux machines or Linux, whichever way you like to say it. I'm going to start calling it Linux because it rolls off the tongue a little bit easier. Okay, but that is the DigitalOcean option. As far as I know, you can literally sign up. You don't have any ongoing monthly commitment. You can cancel these as and when you want to. So yeah, it's one that I forgot about, remembered, and as I say, I've got a couple of people that I know that have used DigitalOcean, and I've never heard a bad thing. So that's not a bad option. Okay, so we're now looking at Google Cloud, okay, or GCP, as it's often quoted. So Google Cloud, again, do you have a free option for a VM? Well, if we scroll down, I'll put the links in the description below anyway. But as you can see, if you scroll down, there's a lot of options. Like all of these things, way too many options. So again, you've got everything from Cloud Functions, which is your serverless environment, and there's a lot of free options there. I mean, 2 million invocations per month. So if you've got a serverless function that's, I don't know, checking the weather, a bit mundane, I know, but I am in the UK, so we are a bit obsessed by weather. But anyway, that's 2 million invocations per month, free. Then there's obviously some other limits as well, but that's not bad. But again, we're all back to VMs at the moment. And by the way, the PubSub offering is very, very good. 10 gig of messages per month. So this is the publish, subscribe. Really good. There are, again, lots of other options on these things. But I did play with this a while ago, actually. So the idea is you can have, many-to-many messaging, but you can also have things where if you've got a server with lots of clients connected, you can publish a message and all the clients can subscribe to that topic, that channel, as it were. And the idea is that as soon as that server issues that message, and by the way, when we say message, that can be data, it could be just text to say hello world, but the clients basically get that in a reliable way for streaming those messages. So it's another thing that we might look at some other time. But right now, back on focus, which is very difficult for me, Compute Engine. So this one is free. You do get a one E2 micro instance per month. That is essentially a bit like the other options. It's about, well, actually, I think Google have actually got a little bit of an edge there. I was just about to say it's 512 meg of RAM, but I think it is actually a gig of RAM with one virtual CPU. And that's free as far as I can see. We'll check the limits, but that seems to be free every month, essentially. Okay, so that is not a bad option. Again, it's going to be a Linux server, and as I mentioned, I'm not going to call it Linux, I'll call it Linux. Right, enough of that, goodness me. But that is another really good option, and again, as far as I'm aware, you don't have to hand over any credit card details. You basically can use that up to the free limit that you will be able to read. Okay, again, I'll put the links in the info below. So that is the Google side of things. Okay, so now we're looking at Amazon, AWS in general. Okay, so we do have the usual side of AWS where you can launch an instance. Again, with like all of the other sort of cloud providers, there are free tiers, and you can see here if I want to spin up an Amazon Linux based server, okay, in your first year, so you've got a year limit on this one, you can get 750 hours, which is basically a month, isn't it? I believe, if my calculations are right. It might not be, so you might want to do that calculation yourself just in case. But it's a T2 micro, so you can sort of see there you've got, you've got some limits as usual. It's a typical thing. It's going to be a small, the smaller end of the scale for the free tier side of things. But again, you've got it free. You've got up to a year. After that, I'm not quite sure. I'll have to double check that. But it's again going to be a very limited server, but it won't be costing you a huge amount. But anyway, the idea is Amazon will also have this something called Lightsail. Okay, so as far as I remember, Lightsail used to be a company on its own that offered a lot of the sort of cheaper cloud host servers, but Amazon bought them. It was a few years ago now, actually. Okay, so the little advantage of Lightsail is that, as you can see on the screen, you've got Linux servers. Obviously Windows you can still spin up, but they are a bit more expensive. Okay, so first of all, are they free? Well, no, they're not. They're not free, but they're close to being free. I'll say that. But the nice thing about Lightsail that I've used is, yep, you can literally pick your operating system. Um, I'm a bit more comfortable, even though I'm certainly no Linux expert, that is for sure. But I tend to go for Ubuntu because I know that a little bit more than the other flavors. But I guess it's more to do with the package managers more than anything that I get lost with. But anyway, you can pick from the sort of common ones: OpenSUSE, obviously Debian, Ubuntu, as I mentioned, CentOS. So the idea is you can just get the OS level server if you want, but for no extra cost because they're open source tools anyway. WordPress multisite, Magento, things like that. And I've used this when I want to spin up like maybe a Magento site just for testing stuff where I can spin it up, play with it for a little bit, do some testing, and then destroy it. Same thing for WordPress as well. So if I want to run things like WooCommerce, maybe I can spin up WordPress, add WooCommerce to it, off we go. Node.js, similar story. And as I say, there's a lot of advantages where this will spin up in a really short space of time and come pretty much pre-configured with all of these tools. So it's only an option. You could do that manually, of course, but it just gives you that little bit of extra advantage of spinning up these types of servers. Okay, so if we look down into the pricing, okay, we can see that, again, not quite as cheap as the DigitalOcean droplets, because that was $4 a month. This is $5 a month, and it's pretty much the same spec, apart from you get a 2 virtual CPU, okay, and 20 gig of storage and a terabyte of transfer. So on par with something like DigitalOcean. It's a little bit better, but again, for that sort of volume, what you're going to run on there, it's probably not going to be a huge difference. And certainly being able to run things like WordPress, etc., you probably are going to need a little bit more oomph, really, for the processing power. And that means at least a gig. In fairness, you may end up going up a little bit further, but again, it's still relatively cheap for a full managed sort of, well, I say managed, certainly a managed VM for WordPress, etc., or something like that. But yeah, it's like everything. What are you wanting to do with these things? But again, it's not free, but it's close to being free. But it's another option. And the same goes for, like I say, the Amazon EC2 instance, where you do actually get free micro, which again is, I'm sure it's a 512 meg or a 1 gig version, but it's a minimal VM. But you do get it free for a year, basically. So after that, we'll have to check the details. But that's the Amazon offerings that I've got so far. Okay, moving on to Microsoft Azure, which there are so many options. Like I keep saying, there are so many options, and I guess the one backlash that sometimes comes out, especially for just individuals, if you're a company, this doesn't really apply, although spending money in any business probably does apply. Anyway, but the point being is, with Azure, when you do sign up for a free account, you do get, I think it's like $200 worth of Azure credits to use in the first year and things like that. So, there's a lot of options, but you do provide a credit card, and that sometimes, even though you're only using free services, people are then a little bit, and quite rightly, a bit careful to say, well, hang on a minute, I've got my credit card, what happens if? For me, and I do use a lot of Azure stuff, I've got in my portal for Azure, I set a budget, basically, and it might be like even as limited as $10 a month. So I shouldn't be coming anywhere close to that because most of the stuff I'm using is free. But if it is, then I start to get notifications, warnings, and I basically can go and kill whatever service it is. Now, I did come unstuck a few years ago when I first started to look at Cosmos DB, which is the planet scale NoSQL database SaaS offering from Microsoft. I was very curious because it allowed you to work with MongoDB type of document storage syntax as well as sort of SQL, and it was really, I thought, great, I want to have a look at this. And I spun up what I thought was possibly a free version, but at the end of the month I got a bill for about £80 UK, so probably close to $100. Now Microsoft did look at the reasons that I explained and said, look, I thought it was a free version, it was just me. Most of the time there was no activity on that service, and they did refund that. But you do have to be careful, certainly, with these things. There's no doubt about it. But that's the trade-off, isn't it? You either find your own, sort of hosting that you can manage yourself, or you're dealing with these sort of cloud providers that give you that ease of use to spin things up, but you do have that drawback there. But as I say, there are ways to mitigate the risk with things like budgets and things like that. And also, a couple of friends of mine actually mentioned they used I think it was like a prepaid credit card, so they put only a limited amount of money on that credit card. So the worst case scenario, it couldn't charge the stuff. Now you've still got a problem if you have been using those charges and Microsoft come after you and say you've not paid the bills. But anyway, you get the idea. There are ways to be sensible, and there we are. There's common sense at play in everything, isn't there? So put a budget on, get notified at least. I do believe even in Azure, if I'm correct, that you can actually say after a certain budget you can actually stop services as well and destroy them. So you've got a few options there to save you from crying at the end of the month with a big bill. Okay. Anyway, moving on. Free. Okay. So yep, similar to Amazon actually, is you get 12 months of a free 750 hours. That is a month pretty much, isn't it? They're pretty reasonable VMs, these ones, the ARM based ones. Okay, but that isn't too bad. That's actually a Windows one, but there's an equal one for Linux ones as well. Okay, so you've got 12 months, and again after the 12 months you're back into the same sort of thing. They're very, if you're going to pick a low like a 1 gig RAM, one virtual CPU, then it's not going to cost you much. It is about $5 or thereabouts. Okay, so so Microsoft Azure, certainly you can get 12 months free, but it isn't going to be ongoing free. What is free, interestingly, and this is a bit of a side subject as well, it's something that's only been released recently, although even a few years ago I've been using like the entry-level Azure SQL database. Okay, it was costing pennies, cents a month, but it was a very limited SQL database. But what they've done recently, it's a serverless SQL database. So obviously there is a server behind it somewhere, but the point being is that with any of these sort of serverless options, there's usually after an hour, if there's no activity, it'll close the service down. Okay, but with Microsoft Azure, this is new as Azure SQL database. It's always free. Okay, now you don't get a month of absolutely free work here, but you do get 100,000 vCore seconds, which in plain English is roughly about 17 hours a month. Okay, so it's certainly not free for the whole month, but again, if you're using it occasionally, doing some prototyping, building some little examples or small projects and things like that, that might be fine, because again, if there's no requests, it will close down after an hour. Okay, I think an hour is the minimal point that you can put. And the good thing is, from my experience so far, is when you then make a request to that database, it spins up in a very short amount of time, literally just, I think, a couple of seconds. So obviously for a mission critical system, that's hopeless. You're not going to do that. Use common sense here. But if you've got something that's a little web app that you're writing or whatever, that's probably not an issue, because after the first spin up, if you've then got multiple requests for the next couple of hours, it's going to be online, live, just a normal SQL database. But the interesting thing is, it is free forever. So you get those 17 hours a month free, ongoing, forever. There's no limit. And the only limits really are obviously the time, but you've now got 32 gig of disk space, of storage, which even with SQL Express, what is it, about 10 gig as the time of recording? So 32 gig, and you get 32 gig of backup storage as well included in that. So you know, you can back up the whole 32 gig of database. Look, if you're running little POCs or your own personal projects, I don't think you're going to come close to that. But if you really wanted to get some use out of it, that's a pretty liberal amount of data there, and it's free, ongoing, not going to go away. It's for the lifetime of your Azure subscription. Okay, now again, by default, after 17 hours, it won't work. Okay, but you could override that and say, well, look, I'm prepared to pay a little bit extra. I don't know what the calculation is. When I did it a few weeks ago, it wasn't a lot. So even if it was running for the whole month, we're in just a dollar or two type territory. It wasn't a lot of money at all. But again, by default, it will cut out at 17 hours. So it won't keep charging you for it. You won't be able to use the database, but it won't delete your data either. Okay, it'll just wait until the next month and then you spin it back up again. So you've got some nice options there, but by default it won't charge you extra. Okay. Azure Functions, the same thing, a million requests, a bit like what we looked at the Google side of things, but certainly the VMs, very cheap, but certainly for 12 months you're getting a low spec VM, but it is whether it's a Linux or Windows, actually, you're getting 12 months of a free VM. Okay, moving on to Oracle. Oracle, you say? By the way, with all of these things that I've been mentioning, there is that sort of religious sort of aspect of technology, isn't there? I don't use that because I don't like them. I use that because I like them. I get it. I do get it. It depends where your allegiances lie. Oracle came under a lot of stick, but they are a big provider, not one of the biggest cloud providers, but certainly up there. And I stumbled across this because I still forgot the company that they bought for the ARM sort of based chip provider, and I've totally forgotten it right now, but I'll try to remember and put it in the links. But essentially you can spin up a free, like, multi-core, multi-CPU server, really, free, and certainly cheap, even if you want a reasonable server running. But anyway, I'm going to leave that alone at the moment. But OCI, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. Okay. Now, the good thing with this, okay, that I could be wrong with some of the other providers, but the one thing with Oracle is I'm using the free tier account. Okay, I did not have to basically put my credit card in at all, which I thought was really, really useful. Okay, so again, you've got lots of other things. They've got maybe not the multitude of services that Azure and AWS have, and maybe that's a good thing because there's too much choice sometimes. But there are a lot of other options. But when it comes down to your compute, if we have a look at the instances here, I've got a free compartment. I haven't put any credit card in. I've got an E2 Micro, which again, it's a Linux-based server. It's got, I think, 512 meg of RAM, so it's pretty low spec, but it's got some reasonable disk storage. I think it's 20 gig, and it's got a very, very liberal ingress egress, sort of like your data transfer out on the web, so that's not a problem either. But the interesting thing, it is always free, as it says there. Look, yeah, and it's been running for far too long. In fact, I'm rather embarrassed to say I totally forgot about this one. And if I go over to the right, you can see when I created it was in Friday, October the 21st, 2022. And now what are we on? 2024. Yeah, nearly 2 years of leaving that running, which is a bit wasteful, isn't it? I really should do something about it. But anyway, just goes to show I've not been charged at all. It's a bit silly to leave it running, but it's definitely an always free VM. You can connect into it SSH. There's a web client, I think, or you can connect through whatever your favorite, desktop app or whatever that you want to use to do that. But again, it's always free. And the nice thing, like I say, is that I have not had to put a credit card in at all. So even if you pick something by accident, you're only going to be able to pick free tier services, because like it says there, you've got to upgrade to a paid account if you want to get access to other things. So it's quite a nice angle, this, and I think it's not talked about, is that by default, because there's lots of independent developers or people who just want to work with a proof of concept or a little, hobby project. By default, it should be like this, shouldn't it, really? It should allow you to have a free tier account, so you can only select things that are in that free tier, knowing that you can't go on a credit card, you're not going to pay money. If you then start to really use those services, you can. But unlike a few of the other providers where you do have to put a card in, it's up to you to make the decision to put a budget in place and things like that. I don't think, like I say, in my experience that I mentioned on Azure, I did, stuff up a couple of times and ended up getting bills for $80 a month or whatever it was. But I did get refunded because I don't think they're absolute monsters. They usually look and see, yep, you've not had any activity on this system. You've just forgotten to turn it off or set up a budget or whatever it might be. But the problem is the onus is on you, whereas this, it's an always free tiered account. So I can't select stuff that's going to cost me money unless I actually make that conscious decision. So I do like that. So Oracle is a good option for that reason as well. And it has really been running for nearly 2 years. So I will either terminate that or do something with it. But that just goes to show. Actually, it isn't 512 meg. It is a gig. I've just realised. Sorry. So it's a one CPU. It's a virtual OCPU. It's a virtual CPU. I am going to have to look at because they refer to the shape of VMs, meaning the shape and size and how much resources are allocated. But there is one that's bugging me, and I'll have to find it. Is with these other like ARM-based chips that you can actually get quite a reasonable. I think it's something like an 8 processor free version. This is a standard one, but again, it's still got a gig of memory, one CPU. But again, for hobby stuff to play around, I mean, it's free, and it's been running for 2 years, for goodness sake. So there you go. So Oracle wouldn't have been my first choice. Not for any other reason other than I wasn't really sure what they offered, to be honest. But it is another good option. So that is Oracle. Okay, and that is a wrap, as they say, for this time around. Thank you. Please like and subscribe, he said in desperation. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm going to be doing more of these sorts of videos. In fact, there are some AI-based videos, like everybody else is doing, coming up, all about RAG, Retrieve Augmented Generation, and agentic systems. Yes, AI agents, my goodness. So we'll be delving a little bit deeper into that, but in the meantime, take care and we will catch you on the next one.